Hey folks, I'm Sarah and I am so thrilled to be on this year's jury for what I think is the best book prize for literary fiction from small presses. It's called the Republic of Consciousness Prize, United States and Canada, and it is dedicated to celebrating fiction published by small presses. Over the last couple of months, I have been sharing individual videos on each of the nominated books for this year's prize, and I'm about halfway through that list. So I thought it might be time to do a compilation video of all the books that I've covered so far, so that if you are just now jumping in and joining us here, you don't have to watch each and every individual video. You can watch this compilation, or if you are so inclined, you can watch them all again and refresh your memory about which ones you might want to check out. I've heard from so many of you that there are books that really sparked your interest. I'm so thrilled by that. It is just beyond my hopes and dreams for posting these individual videos, is getting attention for these books and these publishers. It makes me so happy. I am tearing up. This is how excited I get. I'm literally tearing up right now. Anyway, if you'd like to enjoy all of the half of the nominees so far, please enjoy this compilation video, and I will be back very soon in a week or two with the second half of the list. There are still some killer books on this list. I cannot wait to share them with you. In the meantime, here we go. Enjoy these 23 amazing works of fiction from small presses. First up, but in no particular order, is The Remembered Soldier by Annette Danya, translated from Dutch by David McKay and published by New Vessel Press. This novel is about a wounded soldier from World War I who is living in a mental hospital or asylum in 1920s Belgium. He has suffered an injury that has robbed him entirely of his memory. Anything that happened before his arrival at this hospital is gone. He doesn't remember the war, he doesn't remember his childhood, he doesn't remember his family, nothing. And he lives in this hospital with the other patients and the monks that run the hospital for 4 years, and he's given the name Noon because he doesn't remember his actual name. Until one day, 4 years after he arrived at this hospital, a woman shows up and identifies him as her husband, Amand. And she takes Amand home with her. He goes home with her, and they begin the very arduous process of trying to reintroduce him to his former life. So it becomes a real psychological novel of, what's real, what's not, who's telling the truth, what really happened. One really fun fact about this novel that I didn't really realize until after I read it is that the vast majority, I would say, of paragraphs in this novel begin with the word "and." So just a few examples of the beginning of paragraphs. And when they say their goodbyes, she and Felice embrace. And after school, Rose runs into the kitchen, and he gets up and goes out onto the landing to spend a few minutes alone, and Rose doesn't come back for a long time. And after breakfast, he gets up from the table and says he's going to fix the roof, and he's tired after all the nights of lying half awake. And in the shop, he falls into conversation with a woman, and in the middle of the night, he startles awake, and he's in the studio in her house, and in the middle of the night, he's jolted awake. So the vast majority start with the word "and." I have my own thoughts and theories for why this is and how it impacts the reading experience, but I'll let you read the book for yourself and come up with your own theories, and hopefully you'll share with me in the comments below what you think they are. One clue of my theory of how this impacted my reading experience of this book is actually the word included on the thumbnail for this video. Annette Danya is a writer from the Netherlands. Her books have received many awards in the Netherlands, and New Vessel Press is an independent publishing house based in New York City and specializes in fiction and narrative nonfiction in translation. And they say, "We scour the globe looking for the best stories, knowing that only a fraction of the books published in the United States each year are translations. We believe that knowledge of a multitude of cultures and literatures enriches our lives by offering passageways to understand and embrace the world. We also regard literary translation as both craft and art, enabling us to traverse borders and open minds. We publish great books just in a new vessel, hence the name. We look forward to bringing the world's great literature to ever more readers. And New Vessel Press is also the publisher of Pollak's Arm by Hans von Trotha, and it's translated by Elizabeth Laufer. And this was shortlisted for, I think, the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize for the United States and Canada, whatever the first year was for the prize. This was shortlisted and was actually my favorite book from the prize shortlist that year. They also publish a series of holiday stories from other countries that look really, really fun. So to give you just a sampling, they have, or actually to list all of them, they have published a very Brazilian Christmas, a very Mexican Christmas, a very French Christmas, a very Russian Christmas, a very Italian Christmas, a very German Christmas, a very Indian Christmas, a very Scandinavian Christmas, a very Irish Christmas, and one for each night, which is a collection of Hanukkah stories. And each anthology includes stories from many different authors, including literary greats like Clarice Lispector, Salman Rushdie, Natalia Ginzburg, William Trevor, Dostoevsky, and I could go on and on. There are like amazing authors included in these anthologies, and I've been wanting to invest in these books ever since in 2022 when I discovered New Vessel Press because of the Republic of Consciousness Prize. I found their website, found that they published these holiday anthologies of short stories. So that is the beauty of a prize like this. It can lead you to like so many treasures, just even beyond the books that are on the long list for the prize or beyond the winner of the prize. It can open all sorts of new doors for readers like you and me who are interested in finding hidden treasures. Book number 2 of all the nominees, but in no particular order, is Porthole by Joanna Howard, and this is published by McSweeney's. This book is about Helena Desir, who is a famous film director and cinematic genius who is suffering from the aftermath of a very traumatic and tragic accident on the set of one of her films. And in order to kind of heal from this traumatic experience, she's sent by her film studio, or her bosses sent her to this remote house called the Jaquith House in a remote mountainous, like beautiful lake region. She's sent there to heal, so you're meant to understand that it is a mental health facility of some kind, but it also kind of maybe comes off as a luxury resort of sorts. And the book blurb from the publisher describes her experience there as an extravagant meltdown. And at the facility, she encounters a lot of really offbeat members of staff who are also patients, and patients who are also members of staff. So it's very confusing, a little bit surreal what's going on in this place. And she starts to cycle through a lot of memories of her childhood, of her film career, of her lovelies, which are her kind of romantic relationships with actors that she's worked with over the years. And it is all in an effort to understand what it is that she wants or what it is that she needs. Does she need space and time to heal? Does she need someone to love and someone to love her? Or does she need the freedom to create? Porthole was blurbed by a lot of authors that really caught my eye, like Amina Kane and Mona Awad and Rachel Yoder. But there was one blurb from Jessie Ball, who's one of my favorite writers, that I really got a kick out of. I just loved his blurb, so I'm going to read it. So Jessie Ball wrote, "Howard is what was once called a stylist, but one with a penchant for adventure. Porthole takes part in an intellectual culture that seems in America to have withered on the vine. Philosophical cinema, lexicographical play, and all the delights of the mind and the eye. May she live to 100, raising foxes all the while. McSweeney's is an independent nonprofit publishing company based in San Francisco. They publish a daily humor website that you may already be familiar with called McSweeney's Internet Tendency. My favorite recent post on McSweeney's Internet Tendency, I'll link it below. It was a piece titled "The M- Responds to the AI Allegations." And as someone who uses M- constantly in my writing, I pretty much panicked when I saw like a video saying that like one of the key ways to define or to identify AI writing is to look for M dashes. That just sent me into a panic. So I thought this piece from McSweeney's was hilarious. In addition to several periodicals, McSweeney's also publishes books like Porthole. And they say, McSweeney's publishes boldly. Our books and magazines, elegantly designed, startlingly original, are like nothing else. As a nonprofit, our work is not commercially motivated. In fact, our beautiful books and magazines and the unmatched opportunities we offer readers, writers, and artists are only possible because of donations from our readers and friends. Sales comprise about 80% of our budget, and contributions are the rest. I share that very specific detail from the publisher because it's actually a message that a lot of nonprofit publishers share, that the kind of bold, offbeat writing, original writing that they publish isn't going to probably have a super wide audience. So they do rely on fundraising to like bridge the gap. Especially in an age when federal grants, for example, are really unpredictable. And that's just something for us readers to keep in mind about how these publishers kind of function, for us to keep in mind, especially those of us who really like books that are a bit more off the beaten path, books like Porthole. Book number 3, but again, in no particular order, is Eden's Clock by Norman Locke, and this is published by Bellevue Literary Press. This novel opens in 1906, and Frederick Heigold is sitting in a bar in San Francisco, and he notices a group of patrons who are sitting a little ways off, and as he's listening to their conversation, he realizes one of those other patrons in the bar is none other than writer Jack London. Heigold would love to approach Jack London, who's a writer that he admires. He would love to go up to Jack London and tell him all about the great adventure that he has had himself traveling to San Francisco from New York, because it is an adventure worthy of a Jack London novel. But unfortunately, Heigold can't just go up to Jack London and tell him his story, because Heigold has suffered in the Civil War. He was a soldier in the Civil War, and he suffered an injury to his throat that has rendered him mute. He can't speak at all. So he goes around with a slate and with paper to write down anything he needs to communicate. And so, desperately wanting to share his story with Jack London, he begins to write it down, and that becomes this novel. His journey starts in New York many months before he's a clocksmith. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but he's just lost his wife of many decades to a tragic accident. And after the death of his wife, he is invited to come fix a clock in San Francisco. He's kind of a renowned clocksmith, is my understanding. And so he's invited to come fix this clock in San Francisco, and he thinks, what do I have to lose? There's nothing for me here. I might as well go. And so he sets off for San Francisco, but what should be a fairly short westward journey across the nation unfortunately turns epically disastrous. And along the way, these obstacles that he encounters really reveal the deeply ingrained fault lines that exist in American society at the time, and really speak to those same fault lines that still exist in American society today. And fault lines is a particularly apt term to use because, as you can see from page 1, the night he arrives in San Francisco is in fact the eve of the great earthquake of San Francisco of 1906. Eden's Clock is the final installment in a 12-book series called the American Novels. Each novel is its own standalone book, its own standalone story, but each and every novel in the 12-book series is a tribute to a legendary American literary figure. So this book is in homage to Jack London, the final book. But let me read you the writers who make appearances and all of the other 11 novels in this series. So we have, in the 11 other books, Norman Locke pays tribute to the stories and writing styles of Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Louisa May Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Stephen Crane. Another book to note from Bellevue Literary Press from my shelves is To and Fro by Leah Hager Cohen, and this was on the long list for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, United States and Canada last year. It was also one of my favorite books from the long list, and it is a book that can be read from the front or read from the back. There's two different stories of two different girls. They meet in the middle, and it's fantastic. So that's To and Fro. Bellevue Literary Press has been publishing prize-winning books since 2007, as they share on their website, and they say that they are the first and only nonprofit press dedicated to literary fiction and nonfiction at the intersection of the arts and sciences. They say, we believe that science and the humanities are natural companions for understanding the human experience. I would agree with that. They say, we feature exceptional literature that explores the nature of consciousness, embodiment, and the underpinnings of the social contract. With each book we publish, our goal is to foster a rich interdisciplinary dialogue that will forge new tools for thinking and engaging with the world. And here are two examples. I think To and Fro speaks more to that exploration of the nature of consciousness and embodiment. And Eden's Clock is definitely squarely in the realm of literature that explores the underpinnings of the social contract. Next up is number 4. These are in no particular order, except maybe the order that they arrived in the mail. Number 4 is The Orange Notebooks. This is by Susanna Crossman, and it's published by Assembly Press. After the tragic death of her 6-year-old child, a woman is admitted to a psychiatric hospital when her grief begins to get out of control. And while she's in this hospital, which is in France, she begins to write out her thoughts to try and process what has happened in a series of orange notebooks. And through these journal entries, she obsesses over memories and myths and different symbols or signs she thinks she's encountered in order to try and understand what went wrong and try to figure out how to fix it. For example, she is engrossed with this idea and tradition of telling the bees when someone has died. So there's this tradition in some cultures where if somebody dies in a community, you have to go tell the bees that they have died. And she starts to think that, maybe everything started to go wrong because they didn't tell the bees when her son died. And while she's at this hospital, she meets a man who has a boat and he knows how to sail this boat, and she begins to think that maybe this man can be the person who can sail her to the middle of the English Channel, which is where she thinks the beginning of her son's story began. And she thinks if she can just reach this spot in the English Channel, she'll figure everything out and everything will be fixed. So I want to share with you the moment that she arrives at the hospital so you can kind of get an idea of the style of this book. She's obsessed by a lot of different things, including the color beige, which you'll see. There's just like a page with just the word beige over and over and over again. But when she arrives at the hospital, it says, "On a wet winter day, an ambulance drove me through hospital gates. The grounds were spotted with buildings, some low-lying and others tall. Trees sprang up against the sky, the bare branches were like a web, and I was not sure whether I had been caught or saved. For a net can prevent the death of an acrobat or cage a wild animal." So I think it's so weird, and I love when these kinds of coincidences happen. so weird that 3 of the first books that I read for the prize, 3 of the nominations that came in the mail first, took place at least partially in like a psychiatric hospital or a mental hospital or asylum of some kind. And each of those books, the other 2 were The Remembered Soldier and Porthole, kind of treats memory in a similar way. So while they're in these hospitals, the characters are rifling through their memories in kind of a non-chronological way to try to figure out how they got where they are now. And so that's just a cool connection amongst some of the nominees for the prize. Susanna Crossman is an essayist and fiction writer. She was born in the UK and grew up on an international commune and actually wrote a memoir about that experience called Home is Where We Start, growing up in the fallout of the utopian dream. Assembly Press is a startup publisher of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, and they say, "We make books from our home base in Prince Edward County, Ontario, for a worldwide audience." And other books to note from Assembly Press is The Lodgers by Holly Pester, which I read earlier this year. This was a nominee for the Republic of Consciousness Prize last year, and I read it and loved it. And then also they published The Seers by Suleiman Adonia, which is another Republic of Consciousness Prize related book. This was published by Prototype in the UK and was longlisted for the prize there last year, but it was published by Coffee House Press in the US, and then in Canada it was published by Assembly Press. So that kind of gives you a little idea of some of the books that they have published. Next up is book number 5, though this is in no particular order. This is Unfinished Acts of Wild Creation, a novel by Sarah Yam. It's published by Zank Books. This novel spans decades and is set in both New York and Israel. It's a heartbreaking story that follows one Jewish family that is hit incredibly hard by a devastating genetic degenerative disease. And this family is haunted by all of the choices and mistakes they have to make along the way while they're dealing with this disease, as well as so many other things that happen to them in their lives. We get the perspectives of Leon and Louise, who meet and fall in love in the 1970s. And then we also get the perspective of their daughter, Lydia. And we watch their family tackle everything from mental illness to dealing with parenthood and motherhood and depression and unimaginable loss as well. And I won't share too many more details because I don't want to give too much away. This was a real tearjerker for me, which is saying a lot. I can't share too much about, how I feel about each of these individual nominees quite yet, but I will say this was a tearjerker at the very least. One of the central questions that is asked at the very beginning of this novel, and for context, Louise's mother in the beginning of the novel has just passed away. And even though her mother dies in the very beginning of the book, she's a really huge presence throughout the rest of the novel. On page 14, Louise asks herself a question, and she says, she could hear the sounds of her footsteps and the feeling of her thighs rubbing against each other, but she still wasn't convinced she existed. Every step was her own morbid variation on the "if a tree falls in the woods" dilemma. If a girl defines herself in opposition to her mother, and her mother no longer exists, does the girl still exist? This is a very similar concept and idea to one that came up in the last book I told you about, The Orange Notebooks, in which the narrator in that book has just lost her only child. And in The Orange Notebooks, the narrator says, "I am an empty can, no filling, no stuffing. A mother with a dead child is no longer. A mother with a dead child is a joke." I think it's a really powerful concept to deal with in a novel, this idea that parts of our identity rely on something that is external to us, like someone or something that is external to us is like a core part of who we are. And if we define ourselves based on that relationship to that external person or that external place or whatever it is, and then that person or place or whatever it is suddenly no longer exists, what does that mean for our identity that we have defined almost entirely based on that external factor? And so you can think of that in terms of relationships like motherhood in both of these novels, motherhood, daughterhood, fatherhood. And I also think of, in that a similar way, like statelessness or people whose homelands have been destroyed either by natural disaster or war or international politics. If the place you come from in some way no longer exists in maybe the physical world or on a map, how you define yourself becomes a really big question. And I think that's related maybe to some of these concepts, and it's really interesting for me to think about. So Sarah Yam is a writer and an academic, and her work is focused on the lived experience and social meaning of illness and disability. She lives in Vermont. And Zank Books publishes innovative and award-winning literary fiction and nonfiction. The publisher was created in 2006, they say, to advance great writing and to impact communities nationally with our efforts to promote literary readership and advocacy of creative writing workshops and readings offered across the country. And for those of you who are writers, Zank Books organizes a writing conference in Lisbon, Portugal every year called the Disquiet International Literary Program. It's where writers from North America and also all around the world kind of descend on Lisbon for a couple of weeks for both writing workshops, so to work on their own writing, but also a series of lectures on Portuguese literature. And the goal is to deepen mutual understanding among writers from North America and writers from Portugal. And it looks very, very cool. Book number 6, and again, this is in no particular order. Book number 6 is Behind the Waterline by Kiana Walker-Lamal. This is published by Blair. In this novel, 14-year-old Eric lives with his grandma in New Orleans. His grandma is seen by their local neighborhood as a bit crazy, and she does have some odd quirks. But Eric knows very little to nothing about the rest of his family other than his grandma. There are rumors that his dad was white, but he doesn't know for sure. His mother died when he was born, so he doesn't know much or anything about her either, and his grandma really won't talk about any of it. So he's kind of left to imagine who his family is and what they were all about. And when Hurricane Katrina hits in August 2005, Eric and his grandma find themselves stranded in their completely flooded home, and it seems that no one is coming anytime soon to save them. At one point, Eric is upstairs in his room, and he finds a hidden room behind his closet wall. And he makes his way into this room and finds that it is filled with historical documents and framed articles and things like that. And as soon as he touches something, he is transported to another room that's filled with people who seem to be having some sort of meeting about some kind of protest or act of resistance. And after this happens, he is left wondering, was he dreaming or was he having some sort of vision about the family he never knew? This novel is published in perfect timing for the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. If you've been kind of on the news lately, there have been, never before published photos and videos from Katrina, and seen a lot of kind of photos circulating. This novel vividly brings to life what it was like, not that I would know, but it seems to vividly bring to life what it was like to live through Hurricane Katrina in like the hardest hit area of New Orleans, but not just what it was like to live through the flooding itself, but also the aftermath and kind of where people were sent and what they had to go through once they were displaced from their homes, which was honestly for me just as horrifying as living through the flood itself. I was in college when Katrina happened, and I do remember there were some kids who were brought to our university who had been going to school in New Orleans. I remember that there were a couple kids in some of my classes who were displaced because of Katrina, and that's something that happens to Eric as well in the novel, though he, of course, is in high school, not college, which I think makes it all that more complicated. Kiana Walker-Lamal crafts stories and poetries from the distinct culture and history of the American South. as it says in her bio. And Behind the Waterline is her debut novel, and it was chosen as the winner of the Lee Smith Novel Prize by the contest judge, the writer Disha Filia. Blair, the publisher, is a nonprofit press based in Durham, North Carolina. They publish about 10 to 12 books per year, and they say, "We strive to publish quality writing, focusing on authors and subjects historically neglected by mainstream publishers, including authors of color, authors with disabilities, and LGBTQ+ authors. True to our roots in North Carolina, we look to the many voices of the South and beyond as sources of work and inspiration." Next up is book number 7. Again, these are in no particular order. It's Skin by Catherine Bush. These are short stories published by Goose Lane Editions. And these 13 stories vary widely in length, from just a couple of pages to nearly novella length, it felt like. And they're mostly contemporary realism with a few forays into more kind of historical fiction and a little bit of speculative fiction thrown in there as well. But one thing is shared across all 13 stories, and that is that these are stories about characters who are longing for connection. These are all characters who are longing for meaningful, vulnerable contact with someone or something else beyond themselves. So whether it is a woman who is plagued by migraines, who travels to a headache convention to try to find someone who shares her experiences, to a teacher who is in kind of a green card marriage and is longing for connection that she kind of embarks on a maybe beyond appropriate relationship with a student. There's a man who chases storms, longing to connect with something bigger than himself. And there's Roxanne writing to Cyrano 10 years after Christian's death. These are all characters who are longing to connect with their families, with a lover, with strangers, with animals, with the planet. They're all characters who are seeking some kind of contact beyond themselves. There are a lot of stories about love and loss, and many of the stories, whether in a big way or in a smaller way, incorporate themes of climate crisis. I mentioned that the stories vary in length, and they almost alternate between really longer stories and then really short, compact stories. And in fact, the first story is a really long story, and it is followed by not only a super short story, but it's followed by the title story. So the title story is actually the second story in the book, and it is a really very short, compact, succinct story that it comes right on the heels of a super long story. And I thought it was significant that that second short story was also the title story, and it got me thinking a lot about that tool that writers use and have at their disposal, no matter the unit of writing. They have this tool of varying the length of whatever the unit is. So you could have sentences, you could have a really, really, really long sentence followed by a single word or a really short sentence, and it puts so much impact on that short sentence. Or you could have a really, really, really long paragraph, pages long, and then a writer could right after that put something short, bam, short little punchy sentence there. Or at the chapter level too, I'm sure we've all read books where there's, maybe a standard length chapter, and then all of a sudden you come to a chapter that's like a paragraph or even a sentence with lots of white space, and it's just boom, right there, that short, powerful chapter. No matter the level or like the unit of writing that you're talking about, that technique puts extra emphasis on the short thing. Extra emphasis on that short, powerful, bam moment that comes after something really a lot lengthier. And it makes me think a lot actually of comedy and the rhythm of comedy, especially, when you're thinking of a comedian telling a really long, winding joke with lots and lots of details, and they're building and building and building and building towards something, and then bam, punchline. And that's what this felt like. It felt like a long story to start off the book, to get into the rhythm and to kind of get a sense of what this book is going to be like. And then bam, right after that really long story is just this short title story. Got me thinking about all of the techniques and tools that writers have at their disposal, even when it comes to arranging stories, the order that stories appear in a story. So it felt like that, having that bam title story after the long story was like punchline. Here is wrapped up in one short space everything you need to know about how to read the rest of this collection. Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels. Her most recent novel, Blaze Island, was a Globe and Mail and Writers Trust of Canada Best Book of the Year and the Hamilton Reads 2021 selection, and she lives in Toronto and in an old schoolhouse in Eastern Ontario. Goose Lane Editions is based in Fredericton, New Brunswick's capital, and as they describe themselves, they are a vital part of Canada's ever-morphing publishing landscape. Whether it's homegrown Canadian fiction, singular collections of poetry, books on contemporary art, or courageous stances on environmental issues and global politics, we provide book lovers with great reads that inspire, spur conversation, and stimulate minds. Next up is book number 8, and that is Property by Kate Cayley, and it's published by Coach House Books. This book is set over one single day, but it does move back and forth in the characters' memories and over deep time. And it follows a group of these neighbors who live there who, because this neighborhood is in the process of gentrifying, really range in terms of class and background and ages and how long they've lived in the neighborhood. And so it's this really eclectic group of neighbors who are all collected in this novel, and you watch them throughout the day as they avoid each other, as they spy on each other, as they collide with each other intentionally, unintentionally. We have an old woman who is constantly spying on her neighbors. We have a couple of married couples who are maybe happy, maybe not in their marriages. We have a reclusive 12-year-old boy. We have 10-year-old girls who are very much bullies. There's a construction worker who is recovering from a really traumatic accident, all completely unaware that on this one spring day, they are headed toward disaster. But this novel does not open with the people of the neighborhood. Oh no, this novel opens with rats. So I'm just going to read the first sentence to you. And the first sentence of this novel is, "In the excavated house, there are rats and water." And it does go from there into the perspectives of many of the different characters in this neighborhood, but the rats are always lurking around. And Kate Cayley is an award-winning writer who lives in Toronto. She has previously published 2 short story collections and 3 collections of poetry, and she's a playwright as well. Coach House Books is a Canadian press that is 60 years old. So 2025 actually marks their 60th anniversary, in fact. And to celebrate these 60 years, they are featuring one Coach House title from their archive every week on their social media pages and their blog. And then another book from Coach House Books to note that I have read and loved is The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. And this I was going to say published by Coach House Books because I usually say title, author, publisher, but we know that already. This was shortlisted for the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize, and it also won the Giller Prize as well. Another weird coincidence that I have found across a lot of the books that I've read so far for the prize, a lot of the nominees, is the ubiquity of water, and specifically disasters relating to water. It has appeared in many of the books that I have read so far, and I think that is so cool when something like that happens, when there is some element that keeps popping up in the books that you read. It's just a really cool coincidence, but also you get to see kind of how water appears across different minds of different writers and how it's treated differently in each instance, but it also elementally, it's still water. Water itself behaves the same. So no matter, where you're encountering it and what book it's coming into. So it's cool to see those similarities as well across the books of how water can be such a destructive force. So just to name a couple in addition to Property, and there are more than I have on this list that are not coming to mind right now, but Property Behind the Waterline, the big one, about Hurricane Katrina, Porthole, The Orange Notebooks, Eden's Clock. I'm sure there are others, but those are just some of the books that I've read so far that have some sort of disaster related to water, including property. Next up, but in no particular order, again, is book number 9, and that is On Earth as It Is Beneath by Anna Paula Maya, translated by Padma Viswanathan and published by Charco Press. This slim novel is set in a decommissioned penal colony in the middle of nowhere in Brazil, and a dwindling group of inmates awaits the arrival of officials who are supposed to be coming to move them to another facility, but just aren't showing up. And communication with the outside world seems to have been cut off. Their food is running out. The climate is extremely punishing, and the inmates, one by one, are being hunted down. The remaining men dream of escape, but they are haunted constantly by the bodies that are buried underneath their feet, the bodies of their peers, the other inmates, bodies of their animals, and the bodies of those who have been imprisoned, enslaved, and tortured on this land where this penal colony sits for centuries. This is violent and fast-paced. There's a lot of action packed into this tiny little book. This, I learned after finishing it, is actually somewhat of a prequel to the book of Cattle and Men, and specifically one character, the prequel for one of the characters' stories from Of Cattle and Men. And Of Cattle and Men won the UK Republic of Consciousness Prize in 2024. It was a 2023 published book by Charco Press, and then won the prize in the spring of 2024. So I learned about this prequel nature of the book after I finished it, actually from one of the other judges for the prize, because I haven't yet read Of Cattle and Men, but have been wanting to, and now certainly will. The publisher, however, Charco Press, does not share this detail, that it is somewhat of a prequel on the website or in any of the materials I've seen for the book. So if they didn't want you to know that going into the book, I apologize for telling you now. I'm sorry, but I just thought that was cool and interesting and a good thing to know. Ana Paula Maia is a prize-winning Brazilian author and scriptwriter. She won the Sao Paulo Literature Prize for Best Novel of the Year 2 years in a row, in 2018 for this novel, On Earth as It Is Beneath, and in 2019 for a novel called Bury Your Dead, which is forthcoming from Charco Press in 2027, which is very exciting. Charco Press started in the UK. Charco means puddle in Spanish, and it's also a colloquialism, as they explain, used in some Latin American countries to refer to the Atlantic Ocean. So you can imagine the publisher started in the UK, publishing books from across the puddle in Latin America. And so Charco Press says that they were born from a desire to do something a little out of the ordinary, to bring you, the reader, books from a different part of the world. Outstanding books, books you want to read, maybe even books you need to read. Charco Press is ambitious. We're changing the current literary scene and making room for a kind of literature that has been overlooked. We want to be that bridge between a world of talented contemporary writers and yourself. And they say, we select authors whose work feeds the imagination, challenges perspective, and sparks debate. Authors that are shining lights in the world of contemporary literature. Authors that have won awards and received critical acclaim. Best-selling authors. In short, the very best of contemporary Latin American literature, brought to you in English translation for the first time. And they started in the UK, but they are now distributing in the US as a couple of years ago. My Charco, I just redid my shelves. My Charco stack. Can you see that? No, you cannot see. This is my personal Charco stack. They're very collectible because they all come in these great bright colors and in uniform sizes. And my two favorite to date, probably Charcot titles, are Elena Knows and also The Adventures of China Iron. Two great options if you're looking into checking out Charcot Press. Next up is book number 10, and it's Wilderness of Mirrors by Olufemi Terry, and this is published by Restless Books. I've seen this described as being set in a parallel South Africa, and it's a novel that's all about being young and trying to discover who you are while being in a country and being surrounded by a setting that is very much reckoning with its complex past and moving toward an uncertain future. Emile is a young surgeon in training and has just decided to take a year off of medical school, kind of take a break from medical school. And his father has this idea. His father is a wealthy man who seems to be involved in a lot of ways in politics and seems to have a fair amount of power. So his father has this idea that Emile should head south and stay with his cousins and aunt. And really, the father is sending Emile kind of on a spy mission to kind of report back on how his cousins and his aunt are faring. So Emile sets off for Stadmutter. I don't really know how to say it, but Stadmutter, the city of Stadmutter. And it's a city that is very much more diverse, racially, economically diverse than the city that Emile is from. And so he arrives at his aunt's house and is pretty much immediately seems to be very overwhelmed by his surroundings. And he kind of becomes rather listless, it almost seems. It seems like he doesn't quite know what to do with himself. He finds himself kind of wrapped up in a couple of relationships, both intellectually and sexually wrapped up in two important relationships. And so you follow along as he's dealing with the repercussions of being in these two relationships. And along the way, he gets wrapped up in these really complex, almost slippery social, political, racial, class dynamics that are going on in this city. And young Emile is left kind of reeling from all the moving parts and like hidden agendas of all the people around him, and eventually becomes entangled in kind of an underground political movement that becomes rather dangerous for the people involved. Olufemi Terry is a prize-winning writer. This is his debut novel, and he was born in Sierra Leone and now lives in both Germany and Côte d'Ivoire. And Restless Books, the publisher, is now based in Amherst, Massachusetts, and they are a nonprofit publisher, as they say, devoted to championing essential voices from around the world whose stories speak to us across linguistic and cultural borders. We seek extraordinary international literature for adults and young readers that feeds our restlessness, our hunger for new perspectives, our passion for other cultures and languages, and eagerness to explore beyond the confines of the familiar. And from my shelves, I have read and enjoyed Tenderloin, which is published by Restless Books, and Blood Red, which was actually shortlisted for the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize. Restless Books also has a classics series featuring books like Dracula, Frankenstein, Middlemarch, Passing, and a lot more. I found an article that was written way back in 2015 by Olufemi Terry that is posted both on Electric Literature and The Guardian, and it's all about his experience living and studying in Cape Town, South Africa. In this article from 2015, he talks about setting aside a story that he had been working on for a really long time that was set in New York, because he had lived in New York for a while, to embark on a new tale of something else he was trying to write about Cape Town. And that's where Terry studied creative writing, was in Cape Town. So it makes me wonder if he was referring to this novel in that article. And the way he describes Cape Town in that article is really reminiscent of the descriptions of Stadmutter in this novel. He describes it as this really slippery place, as hard to get a handle on, and that's how Stadmutter is depicted here in Wilderness of Mirrors. Also, the physical descriptions of the place, which are really, really vivid, in this novel they seem to make an appearance in the article about Cape Town as well. So one quote from the article says, "Cities contain paradoxes within them, but none I have lived in had so many as Cape Town. The environment, land and sea, is romantic in a German Sturm und Drang sense. Table Mountain looms like a panopticon tower over semi-desert. The rocky Atlantic wild sea throws up high, cold waves." I feel like that could have come straight from this novel. Next up is book number 11. This is Mothers of Fate by Lynn Hugo, and this is published by Blank Slate Press, which is an imprint of Amphore Publishing Group. This one I feel like I have to be careful to describe because so much of this novel is built around the order in which details are shared. So Monica is an attorney, and she's in her office one night when a woman arrives saying she needs to hire a lawyer. And this woman, whose name is Deanna, proceeds to tell this long, winding story from her past. And eventually, as you get kind of flashbacks to the past and you learn Deanna's story, you learn that Deanna wants Monica's help tracking down Deanna's son, who she gave up for adoption when he was born 30 years before. But it's also important to note that Monica and her wife have recently adopted a baby of their own. And everything, all of the background and secrets proceed to kind of unfold from there. And the novel, by exploring these characters' lives and stories, deals with really intense ethical questions, especially related to adoption, but also related to marriage and infidelity and sex and love and abuse and manipulation and parenthood. There's so many themes that come up in this novel, but they're all tangled together. It's not like one theme appears in one thread and then another and another thread. They're all wrapped together in all of the stories that come together in these characters' lives. And you follow multiple perspectives too. So you follow Monica in the present and Deanna in the past, Deanna with her story from the past that she's sharing with Monica. And then you also have the perspective of the parents who adopted Deanna's baby. And then you get several other perspectives that I won't mention so as not to spoil anything. Lynn Hugo is an award-winning author of many different novels. She's from New England but now lives in Ohio, and she has one of the best openings to an author bio that I think I've ever read. So she writes, "I write in black Walmart capri sweatpants. They don't start out as capris, but I routinely shrink them in the dryer by accident." She just has a lot of quirky, lovely details in her bio, so definitely check that out. This is published by Blank Slate Press, an imprint of Amphore Publishing Group. And Amphore Publishing Group is a woman and veteran-owned business. Amphore was created in 2014 with the merger of Blank Slate Press and Walrus Publishing, and they say, "We are driven by our commitment to our authors and to the art of writing. Our goal is to publish emerging and established writers contributing to the diversity of the written word." And as I mentioned, Mothers of Fate weaves across different perspectives of the members of the mostly three main families of this story. And so you are weaving back and forth with the perspectives, but then you're also weaving back and forth in time. And when you have a novel that really gets its momentum from the very carefully planned release of bits of information, I think it's really helpful to have that novel told through different perspectives and going back and forth in time. And I personally find it very satisfying because I know with every switch in perspective and in time that I'm going to get a little bit more of the story, because that's kind of how it functions. You get back and forth and you accumulate the full picture. But then that switching also helps slow down the reveal of information because you are doing this switching back and forth, which takes time, and that builds anticipation too. It's just another one of those awesome tools that writers have in their toolbox, and you see it in TV and film a lot too. And I'm so curious to hear from you books or shows that you've read and enjoyed that do that switch back and forth perspectives in order to control the release of key pieces of information and build that anticipation. If you have any great examples, leave them in the comments below for us all to share together, because that's definitely how this book is functioning, switching back and forth perspective. So it's always fun to learn, other great examples. Next up on the list of nominees is book number 12, Lonesome Ballroom by Melon McDonald, published by Rescue Press. We meet our narrator, Betty, at dinner on a Tuesday, duck à l'orange, with her husband, Henry. Betty is crying for some reason. We don't know why. Betty doesn't seem to know why. Henry doesn't seem to know why either. Betty cries a lot in this novel, and figuring out why is kind of the point of the whole thing. On this Tuesday in question, Betty leaves Henry at the dinner table and makes her way to a local drinking establishment called the Lonesome Ballroom. I had to check to make sure I turned it right side up again. The Lonesome Ballroom is where Betty heads. She proceeds to get completely wasted and then starts to give us the long, winding, back and forth story of why it is she might be crying all the time. It's a story told in bits and pieces, but once it accumulates, it's the story of Betty's family, the women in her family, and maybe a little bit of the story of the men in her family. It's also a story of film and art and performance and family and friendship and love and failed relationships and disappointment and independence and longing and so much more. Basically, it is the story of the glittering wreckage that is Betty's life. Stylistically, this is very inventive. There are a lot of phrases that are crossed out and photographs peppered throughout the book and words that are spelled in a way to mock the character that is speaking those words. And Melon McDonald is the author of 3 books of fiction, but this is her debut novel. She has an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and has taught creative writing at many places and currently lives in Oregon with her family. Rescue Press is a publisher I've been wanting to read from for a while. They're an independent publisher of poetry, prose, and hybrid texts based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They call themselves a library of chaotic and investigative work. And they say, at Rescue Press, we value experimentation, conversation, care, and idiosyncrasy. We are interested in high contrast writing that pushes the boundaries of genre. We believe in the form, technology, and potential of the book as object, as well as its relationship to the visual, digital, and performative experience. And that, you can see that shining through in this book that they published this year. It does feel in a lot of ways like an active performance in the way that it is written and styled. And so it's really cool when you can see a mission of a publisher coming through in the books that they choose to publish in such a vibrant way. I love reading and then rereading blurbs for a book, both before I read the book and then after I've read the book, to see kind of how well they match up. The art of blurb writing is is of interest to me. I love a good blurb. And I think the blurbs for this book will really give you a sense of what it feels like to read this book. So some choice words that I've picked out from among the blurbs include giddy, acrobatic, a bejeweled hand grenade, which is my favorite, literary firestorm, deranged, daring. And then I will read one blurb in full because it's from Lindsay Hunter, who herself is a rock star novelist and teacher. So Lindsay Hunter says, Melon McDonald's Lonesome Ballroom has gifted us Betty, a woman painfully in thrall to what every woman knows, that we are too often defined by what we are to others. Well, Betty refuses. The only way out is to smash everything to bits. Will she? Can she? I feel delightfully pulverized by this bright, desperate, mordantly funny voice. And again, that's from Lindsay Hunter. And I think that's an incredible summary of Lonesome Ballroom by Madeline McDonald. Next up, but again in no particular order, is book number 13, and that is The Endless Week by Laura Vasquez, translated by Alex Niemi and published by Dorothy, a publishing project. This I've seen compared to the work of Samuel Beckett, Franz Kafka, and Hieronymus Bosch even, which I think is a particularly apt comparison, the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. This is ultimately the story of one family who is struggling with a lot of different things, but ultimately these trials they're experiencing are things that a lot of families experience. There is a grandmother who is dying. There is an absent mother. There's a father with a very traumatic past who deals with his trauma by cleaning relentlessly. And the kids in this family are addicted to their phones and addicted to the validation they get from sharing their lives online and interacting with strangers online. But if this family experiences trials that are difficult but not uncommon trials, they experience them in ways that you have never seen before. Every scene in here eventually descends into something absurd, nightmarish, obscene, fantastical, grotesque. But every absurd, nightmarish, grotesque scene that's depicted in here is done so in a language that is, I would say, delightful, which is odd to say about kind of intense situations that are happening, but the language is delightful and it's also crystal clear. I was never confused like I often am in more surreal, kind of absurd writing. Laura Vasquez is a leading figure in contemporary French literature. She is the winner of the 2023 Prix Goncourt for poetry, and The Endless Week is actually her debut novel, and she lives in Marseille, France. And Dorothy, the publisher, is Dorothy, a publishing project, is a press dedicated to works of fiction or near fiction or writing about fiction, mostly by women. Each fall they publish exactly 2 books, although I think last year it was 3. Or maybe they were republishing one last year and that was why it was 3. 2 books, for the most part, each fall, simultaneously on the same day. And they say we work to pair books that draw upon different aesthetic traditions because a large part of our interest in literature lies in its possibilities, its endless stylistic and formal variety. It's one of the publishers that I get most excited about each year, and I think they've done this brilliant thing by releasing 2 books at the same time every year because it builds excitement. I think people really get excited about what Dorothy is going to publish this year. I will show you some of my books that my small but growing Dorothy collection. My personal favorite book so far from Dorothy, a publishing project, is The Long Form by Kate Briggs. I love that book, but I've loved a lot from them. So if you go to Dorothy's website and you find The Endless Week on their website, you will find a link to a great piece written by the co-founder of Dorothy, whose name is Martin Riker. And in that piece, Riker points out that the joy of this novel is largely found, as I kind of hinted above, is largely found in these many single sentences that just stop you in your tracks. He gives one example that's from the very beginning of the book that I'm going to read to you. A head doesn't just fall off. It can't fall off. It's connected to a thin string that goes all the way down to a person's feet. And if the head falls off, so does everything else. You should avoid breaking your head, but you can break your limbs. When you break a limb, you remember the limb is there. When a tooth gets infected, it vibrates inside, almost as if it's speaking. When you pinch your hand, it suddenly appears. If a person puts an eye out, it becomes the main thing about them. Yeah, I remember stopping. It's not even the end of the paragraph, but I remember stopping at that sentence and thinking, yeah, if someone loses an eye, that definitely becomes pretty defining, I would guess, I would wager. And another one that I actually shared with my family when I read it, it's in this section about people who have an extra finger, and the narrator is talking about, like, if you have an extra finger, and then is talking about how every finger has a name. You have your thumb, pointer, middle, ring, pinky finger, and then says, each finger has a name. What do you call an extra finger? An excellent question. And maybe we should ask Count Rugen. Next up is book number 14. It's Cece by Emily Profet, translated from French by Aidan Rooney and published by Archipelago Books. A young woman named Cecilia, or Cece for short, lives with her grandmother in a gang-controlled neighborhood on the outskirts of Port-au-Prince, Haiti, where a string of thugs terrorize their impoverished community. When Cece's grandmother dies of fright, really, during a night of intense gunfire in the neighborhood, Cece is left to fend for herself. And she's finally able to make ends meet to feed herself and her alcoholic uncle, who lives with her, by pursuing both sex work and becoming a social media influencer. But through her eyes, we see the complex, real-life social network of her community. We see how they care for one another, how they grieve their losses, and how they ride the endless wave of violence in their neighborhood. And Emily Profet is a prize-winning author of 2 poetry collections and 6 novels. She is a former director of the National Library of Haiti, and her bio says that she plays an important role in Haiti's governance, bringing cultural curation and social justice to the fore. And Archipelago Books is a nonprofit press committed to publishing exceptional translations of classic and contemporary world literature. They say, in our first 20 years, we have brought out 250 classic and contemporary works from more than 40 languages and have hosted at least 650 literary events across the country. We seek out vital works from diverse perspectives and literary traditions and present them in elegant editions. We feature groundbreaking voices, often from the margins, that otherwise might not be heard. And I have a small collection of Archipelago books, but they're another publisher I always have my eye on, another very collectible publisher, because they have such similar formats to all their books, which again, I think is a smart move by any small press to kind of make yourself very collectible and have people excited when your books come out and excited to build a collection of your work. Cece is one of those books that is centered on one main character, one narrator, and is even named after her, but really is the story of so many more people in this community than just Cece herself. And you're really immersed in these kind of rotating portraits of her neighbors, and you get their backgrounds, sometimes going back to even before Cece was born. And these are like the smaller stories of the trials that they each went through within this more continuous story of Cece's kind of journey and her trials that she's going through as she tries to survive in this place. And one of my favorites was a young man who kind of befriends Cece, but then through a series of events becomes the neighborhood's next gang leader, and his story does not end well. It's a tough subject matter. These are tough characters. They have to be tough. But I think ultimately there are a lot of moments of brightness and hope and love and even vulnerability in Cece's story. Next up, we have book number 15 on our nominee list, and that's Iris and the Dead. This is by Miranda Schreiber, and it's published by Book Hug Press. And you can see there's a spooky graveyard there at the top of the book. In Iris and the Dead, we have an unnamed narrator who reflects on the period of her life starting at age 12, when she both experiences a debilitating depression, but also starts to realize that she's queer. But the novel, though this period in her life starts when she's 12, the novel really starts when she's 18, when she starts to see a therapist whose name is Iris. Iris is 27, so to 18-year-old narrator seems a much older and wiser guide, therapist. And Iris really helps guide the narrator through the process of finally coming out. But Iris also takes advantage of their relationship in ways that the narrator eventually realizes is very much abusive. And now the narrator is 26 years old, and she decides it is time to set the record straight and get her story down on paper. Meanwhile, the narrator is also dealing with inherited generational trauma, and this is where the dead come in. The dead, literally in this book, are the narrator's ancestors, and the ancestors are tied in with the narrator's depression in a really beautiful and interesting way that I won't spoil here, but it all ties together in this really fascinating, mostly the middle section of the book. The ancestors come back and are really beautifully tied in with the narrator's decade-long experience of depression. Miranda Schreiber is a Toronto-based writer and researcher, and Iris and the Dead is her debut book. Bookhug Press is a Canadian-owned and operated, radically optimistic independent publisher, as they call themselves, working at the forefront of contemporary book culture. They say, we specialize in bold, dynamic literary fiction, literature and translation, poetry, and narrative nonfiction. And they say Bookhug Press has made an impressive mark on the domestic Canadian-owned independent publishing landscape. And I love their description of their impact on the Canadian publishing world. They say, we're proud to be part of Canada's vital independent publishing community. We champion and support Canadian and international voices and stories and produce and manufacture all our books in Canada. What does this mean? It means we mainly work with Canadians on our books from start to finish, including authors, editors, proofreaders, translators, designers, sales reps, distributors and wholesalers, printers, booksellers, marketing professionals, and more, to get them into the hands of as many readers as possible. Iris and the Dead does what I always want a first-person narrated novel to do. It gives an answer to the why now, is what I kind of call it. My favorite first-person narrated books always have a solid and interesting reason for why they are written in first person. Why is this person telling this story now? Let me know examples in the comments of books written in first person that do a good job in your eyes of answering that, the why now. Why this person? Why are they telling it now? And for the narrator in Iris and the Dead, the why now is because the narrator is about to turn 27. Iris was 27 when she served as the narrator's therapist, and when, by abusing that role, Iris inflicted so much lasting harm and damage on the narrator. So the narrator wants to set the record straight now before she becomes the same age or older than Iris was when she inflicted this harm. Because she's worried that once she's older than Iris, she might be tempted to kind of brush over some of Iris's behavior as the behavior of a young woman. She'll start to see Iris as a young woman making mistakes, big mistakes, but a young woman making mistakes instead of an older woman abusing her position. We continue the theme of books that are perfect for the October season with book number 16 from my nominee list, and that is Dreaming of Dead People by Rosalind Belbin, and this is published by And Other Stories. This novel was originally published in 1979 and has been long out of print. A woman named Lavinia is now 36 and has realized now that she's reached middle age, middle life, that she will very likely live out the rest of her life alone. She has been unlucky in love. She will never have children. Keep in mind, this was written in 1979. 36, I guess, seemed much older back then, I hope. 36 sounds pretty young to me. Her parents are dead. All her beloved pets are dead. She faces a future that will be defined by solitude, and she's regretful in a lot of ways of that, but then also is kind of approaching it in a very, what I would call, fearless manner as well. And that's pretty much what this book is about. It's about Lavinia facing a future of solitude. But we don't get there in a straightforward way. Along the way, we get an excellent fantasy involving Robin Hood, we learn some interesting and very personal uses for electric toothbrushes, and I'll let you discover those uses for yourself when you read the book. And we also get these amazing glimpses of Lavinia's childhood in the countryside of England. It's a childhood that's filled with loss and brutality, but also a lot of beauty as well. And Rosalind Belvin was born in 1941. She spent her early childhood in rural Dorset, which, if I remember, I feel like the childhood of Lavinia is also set there, and it's in the southwest of England. And her life since then, though, has also been fairly nomadic, moving from place to place and job to job. And the result is that in her work, both the Dorset countryside and foreign destinations, like in here it's Venice. I'm getting confused because the narrator's father died in Naples, so I keep wanting to say Naples, but it opens in Venice. Anyway, the result is that both the Dorset countryside and foreign destinations feature prominently in her work. And other stories will actually be republishing 2 more of her books in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. And Other Stories is a publisher based in Sheffield in England, and in 2013 they also started publishing titles in the United States. And they say, "We select carefully and hope you will agree that the books are good, make you think, and able to last the test of time. We aim to push people's reading limits and help them discover authors of adventurous and inspiring writing. And we want to open up publishing so that from the outside, it doesn't look like some posh Freemasonry," which will go down as one of my favorite indie press about pages of all time. And Other Stories books from my shelves include Your Love Is Not Good, Lublin, and Get 'em Young, Treat 'em Tough, Tell 'em Nothin', one of my favorite titles. All of 3 of those made long lists for the Republic of Consciousness Prize in past years. I've seen in a few places, actually, Dreaming of Dead People compared to the work of Virginia Woolf, and that includes in the introduction by Gabriel Josepovici, who says Belvin is a master of punctuation. No one since Virginia Woolf has used commas and semicolons to such effect. And it's true, there are a lot of semicolons, which I love. I love using semicolons. Lots of semicolons, lots of colons actually, and lots of commas that are used in ways, like lots of commas in general, but like commas that are used in ways that feel ever so slightly off. Like maybe you wouldn't put a comma there, or it kind of interrupts your reading process. And it's kind of hard to explain, but to me it felt like reading someone's thought process, like in the moment of thought, like reading the thought process. It flows kind of like thought, with a fair amount of repetition and backtracking, and then jumps that are kind of hard to follow. Like you don't quite understand what she's jumping to, or where you are. It's a little disorienting. And it really is like reading someone who is in the act of thinking, or in the act of figuring out what they think, like without the added polish and like streamlining of editing and rethinking. Not that I don't think this is carefully edited, I'm sure it is, but it's done in a way to almost preserve the raw movement of thoughts. And the final book in my little mini collection of books for October is book number 17 on my nominee list. That's My Father's Orchards by Dominika Radulescu, and this is published by Histria Books. This is historical fiction that spans mostly from 1939 to 2015. It's the story of one Romanian family that lives through seemingly endless wars, devastation, persecution, and loss. Though the novel weaves throughout time, back and forth through time, it's really framed by the story of Karina in 2015. She has returned to Romania for the first time since fleeing the country with her family in the 1980s. Eventually they made it to the United States, and she is now returning to Romania for the first time, and specifically has come to the hometown of her father, the town her father grew up in, and the actual house that he grew up in, and the orchards that the family owned and lived on. And while she's there, Karina encounters the entirety of her family's very complex but very devastating and heartbreaking history and lives living through World War II and post-war Russian invasion, and then the post-war communist dictatorships. But that family history is not all she encounters. There are ghosts in these orchards, very real ghosts. And Karina, in order to make any sense of her family's history, has to first learn how to listen to these ghosts. And Dominica Radulescu is a novelist, playwright, and academic. She holds a named professorship in comparative literature at Washington and Lee University, and her previous novels are internationally acclaimed. She actually received a Fulbright Award to travel to Romania to research this novel, which was inspired by her own father's story and life in Romania. And Histria Books is a leading independent publishing house that has offices in both Las Vegas and Palm Beach. They're named for Histria, an important center of culture and commerce in the ancient world, which was located on the Black Sea coast. And they have several imprints, including academic books, a whole Romanian studies imprint, a children's imprint, general lifestyle nonfiction, genre fiction, literary fiction. They have a whole range of books. And they must have some tie. I'm seeing a lot of Romanian connections in the work that they publish, but I wasn't able to find specifically a connection there, and would love to hear if you know more about that. Let me know in the comments. I am personally fascinated by the use of the paranormal in this novel, and even though I'm including it in my little October roundup of nominees that are perfect for October because of the ghosts, I'm including it because there are ghosts in this book. The ghosts here are not at all akin to ghosts that you would find in a horror novel. This is not horror. It's not a mixed blend of genres, including horror. It's very much historical fiction. Historical fiction allows us to access imaginatively the history of people and times that we can no longer access, right? It gives us the ability to kind of travel there and to imagine things that we can't experience ourselves. And the ghosts included in this novel are also used to tell the histories of people that we can no longer actually physically access. They're there, they function in an imaginative way, a lot like historical fiction functions. And through the history of these ghosts and the people in this novel, I learned so much about the history of Romania in the 20th century. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm interested to hear if you have other examples of fiction that does something similar with paranormal elements or ghosts, that the book uses paranormal elements not at all in a spooky way. It is not spooky, but it is instead a literary device, and it's not supposed to be anything close to horror, but instead these paranormal elements are used as a literary device to bring forth the full story, a full story. So if you have examples, please let me know in the comments. And here, this is my example for you. Book number 17 was My Father's Orchards, and book number 18 is My Mother's Boyfriends by Samantha Shea, published by 713 Books. These are 14 stories that range from realist fiction to slightly fantastical fiction. Most of them are either set in San Francisco or make some reference to San Francisco. Almost all of them are following women, female characters as mothers, daughters, wives, lovers, sisters, friends. And I think every single one of these stories are about people making mistakes. There is a story of a woman who lives through a major disastrous earthquake and sees her boyfriend die crushed before her very eyes, or maybe not. Maybe she was mistaken and he wasn't even actually with her at all. There's a story about a woman who's a faculty member at a university and she starts sleeping with the custodian of her building. The question becomes, is the mistake she makes the fact that she's sleeping with the janitor of her building, or is the mistake that she's not taking that relationship seriously enough? There's a story about a woman who mistakenly leaves a tampon in and has to go to the ER to have it removed, or maybe she didn't. And there's a story about a mother who leaves her 2 very young children overnight to sleep in a van in a parking lot outside a dance club so she can spend her night dancing away. And I think most of us readers read that and think, big mistake, lady. So I really do think that all of these stories have that element of people making mistakes, making choices, and then having to deal with the consequences of those choices. And Samantha Shea lives in San Francisco with her bookseller husband, her twin teenagers. In 2014, she founded Independent Bookstore Day, which is so cool, and was the program director for that program for 8 years. This book has such a memorable cover, and I was delighted to learn. It seems that this is a photo taken by the author's father, and they used it for the cover of the book, which is very cool. 713 Books is a publisher that's run by authors for authors, and it's committed to making beautiful works of literary fiction and offering a publishing experience that's respectful to and even reverent of first-time authors. They say they're part of a vibrant independent press ecosystem that is passionate about keeping literature alive and saving quality manuscripts that have fallen through the widening cracks of a backsliding, inefficient book industry. From my shelves, I have a book by Christine Sneed called Please Be Advised that was published by 713 Books. Christine Sneed was one of my writing professors in college, and she's a fantastic novelist and short story writer, so definitely check her out. If you've been here a while, you know that I often really enjoy slightly offbeat fiction, like a little wacky, a little weird, and I think that's why I love short stories so much, because I personally think they are the best vehicle for fiction that explores slightly unusual situations. I love a short story's ability to just like dip in to an unusual, wacky, weird situation and then get right back out. You don't have to worry about extending or like exploring any logistical details about an odd scenario too much because the form is short. But I think for me, really great short story collections, ones that I tend to enjoy the most, have something else going on. They have a good range of those offbeat, weird scenarios where you're just kind of dipping in and out and you get that emotional punch from them, but it's not like an extended, and I'm not talking about length necessarily of the story. I'm talking about emotional impact. The short story collections I love have maybe 1 or 2 stories in them that you want to live in for a little bit longer. For me, in this collection, that story that I wanted to live in for longer was the last story, which was about a woman who takes a DNA test and discovers she has a sister that she never knew about. And the story is her taking her teenage daughter to go visit this long-lost sister. And that was one that the characters were great, the situation was great, there was a really fantastic mistake going along the mistake theme. That was that story for me in this collection that I would have been happy if it had gone on even longer. I'm so curious to hear what makes a good short story collection for you. Do you love those outrageous, slightly weird, slightly offbeat situations, or do you like a collection of stories that feel maybe more novelistic in style, maybe are situations that you wish even could be extended into a novel, or do you like a mix of both? I would love to know what you think in the comments below. Next up is book number 19, The Time of the Novel by Laura Mimosa Montez. This is published by Wendy's Subway. In this slim novella, a woman wakes up in an apartment that she's living in temporarily. She's subletting it from a mother and her teenage daughter. It is the narrator's goal in this novella to abandon her life, at least temporarily, to become a narrator. Not like an audiobook narrator. We're not talking about voice acting here. She wants to become the disembodied entity that narrates novels. And she has a lot to say about this project. So a few examples. She says, "My intention in securing this apartment was to live out an unclaimed desire, to give myself over to the spell of narration and pass through time like a tongue without a body." And she says, "In pursuing this fantasy of becoming a narrator, I wish to hover in the fray and observe." And she also says, "It was also a great relief to pretend that I was, for the time being, rather than a person, a figure of the imagination, a subjecthood, a shadow." And she says, "In solidarity with the narrators I liked most, I was determined not to work a real job." So she goes about this task that she's set for herself, but she also has to do her daily things you need to do to live in the world. She still does her shopping. She still goes to at least one social event where she attempts to actually describe what she's trying to do here. But all the while, she's trying to disappear, to withdraw from the world, to just become like a floaty observer, a narrator. She wants to remove herself from the real and enter into fiction. And Lara Mimosa Montes is a writer, editor, and teaching artist who, as her bio says, whose practice and experiences span the fields of alternative publishing and experimental writing. She's a faculty member of the Creative Writing MFA program at Pacific Northwest College of Art, and she also teaches in XE, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement Master's Program at NYU. And she was born in the Bronx. And Wendy's Subway is actually a physical reading room, writing space, and independent publisher in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And they say about themselves, "We support emerging artists and writers in making experimental, urgent work and create alternative modes for learning and thinking in community." Wendy's Subway is dedicated to encouraging creative, critical, and discursive engagement with arts and literature. We prioritize collaboration and horizontal decision-making in our work towards being a responsive and sustainable organization. And they have lots of programming that includes free readings, talks, performances, reading groups, workshops, residencies, and a library with over 4,000 titles. So when I was thinking about kind of what to talk about today with this novel, I kept returning to that first sentence that I read, and I'll read it again. It says, "I woke up in the bedroom of a 16-year-old girl, unsure if the blood on the sheets was mine or hers." You know, I don't always remember first sentences as I'm reading through a novel. I usually return to them once I'm finished with them, but I don't necessarily have them in mind as I'm reading the whole novel. But this one was really striking, and I think it was because it was about blood on the sheets, no less. Throughout the rest of the book, the narrator keeps saying she wants to leave her body behind, when that first sentence was very much related to the body, related to having a body, related to the kinds of evidence a body leaves behind. And I had a lot of fun puzzling out how that image in the first sentence related to the rest of the book, which led me to thinking about first sentences in general. And I was recently in a great writing class led by the incredible novelist Lindsay Hunter. And in one of our sessions, she talked a lot about openings of novels, and how a novel's opening passage has to teach you as a reader how to read the rest of the book. It has to kind of set up the rules of the book. A good opening to a novel gives you what you need to know to understand the rest of the novel, whether it's something about the themes or the characters or the structure. Something about that opening helps guide you through the rest of the novel. So I challenge you to go back to a novel you loved, either something you've read recently or not, and read the opening passage and try to figure out how that opening passage set you up to read the rest of the novel. Did it establish any rules by which you could understand what was going on throughout the rest of the book. I would love to know in the comments what you find. This is my example for you of an interesting situation, an interesting opening that really determined how I read the rest of the novella. Next up is book number 20. It's The Red Light Starts Blinking. It's by Jonathan Cain, and it's published by Diacrineity Books. I'm going to change up my format for this one a little bit and actually start with the publisher instead of starting with the book, because I think it will actually help set up the book. So Diacrineity Books is a creative outlet for the collective publication of book-length fiction. If you have been here a while, then you maybe know that I love about pages of indie presses. They're so fun to read, and this is a winner. So they say about themselves: we bring odd, low literary creatures into the world, the niche or experimental kind, the sort that make conventional publishers say, "What an intriguing idea, but how would we sell that? Who's even the audience?" Diacro isn't so keen on convention. Our vibe is more like an artist collective than a top-down business. A boarding house for a ragtag gang of literary partners in crime. We hold up our authors hold up us, our authors hold up our other authors, and then we collectively moan about how hard it is to get featured on Book Talk. We cooperate with writers of unhomable literature to produce uncanny books that claw at, freak out, and gently tickle the minds of readers who want media that challenges, not coddles. Jonathan Cain lives in Australia. This is his debut fiction collection. So let's start with the cover. This is a cockatoo. I want to point this out because my son he helps me open the books as they arrive in the mail, and he was very delighted by this cover with its cockatoo, and it is very striking. That is a memorable cockatoo for sure. This is definitely experimental, very fragmented fiction. It's described on the back of the book as less a collection of short stories and more a set of interlocking teeth, which is a great description. It follows a set of characters. Many of them are men, not all. I believe, as says in the description, they either live or are visiting or drifting through Australia's Blue Mountains region. There are definitely a lot of recurring themes. One of the big themes are people who have gone missing. That keeps happening over and over again in the book. There are also recurring characters and situations and images that seem to float in and out of the stories or the sections. The stories that are easiest to sum up include one about a man who takes a gardener position at a retirement home. There's a story about a reclusive character who moves back home after their father's death and tries to make sense of a bunch of messages that the father has written around the house in chalk. And I think the implication is that the father was suffering from some sort of dementia and was writing all of these messages. And there's another story called Arthur, My Grandfather in 100 Pieces, which is a numbered list. I love a story that's a numbered list. It's a numbered list of things that this grandfather does and says. And it's funny and touching and sad and sometimes infuriating, but it's a great piece. Some of the stories are a lot denser and harder to explain in a short video, but I will say that there is a big range of structure used. Some of those stories are structured like the numbered list in a way that I feel like gives you breathing room after a denser section. I really appreciate it when experimental fiction in particular does that, where there's something that's particularly dense and then there's a bit still interesting, still experimental, but it definitely gives you a bit of breathing room before you dive back in. And along those lines, peppered throughout the book, there are sections of a recurring piece called News in Brief Lives. It's like news headlines like you might see in Chicago every day in the news in Chicago, like man shot in the loop or woman mugged on the L platform. But these are a little different, and I'll give you a few examples. So like local woman veers between being an omnivore and a vegan depending on who she's dating. Local man spends an entire day alone watching the light move slowly across the lawn. Local man, when asking his father for bread, receives in turn stock quotes. Local woman says, I have no friends and you're one of them. I want to come back to this term that the publisher used on their about page, unhomable literature. I love that phrase, and it got me thinking a lot. And you know that the publisher does not intend that to refer in any way to the quality of the writing that they publish. It's really just shorthand for books that are hard to market. Books without comp titles, books without a clear genre, books without any connection to like current trends. Basically, books that don't have those kind of easy tags that publishers use to say to readers, hey, this book is for you. Because publishers know they only have a few seconds to grab. They often only have a few seconds to grab most readers' attention. So they really lean on those shortcuts, like any business does when trying to sell something to you. But there are plenty of readers out there who don't want those easily labeled books, who actually prefer the harder to define stuff. And those readers need a way to find books too. So that's why I think unhomable literature is such a brilliant phrase, because it's doing exactly what those other, usually bigger publishers think they can't do. It instantly tells the right kind of reader, this is a book for you. It's a smaller audience, but it's still out there. So I'm so curious, do you have a book that you love that you might consider unhomable literature that eventually obviously did find a home? Do you even think that you are a reader that would ever gravitate towards those, what you might call unhomable literature? Or do you prefer something in a particular genre or that has a particular hook? I would love to know in the comments. Book number 21 is The Longest Way to Eat a Melon by Jacqueline Zong Lee Ross, published by Sarah Band Books. As Danielle Dutton put it in her blurb, and Danielle Dutton, if you don't know, is the co-founder of another great publisher called Dorothy, a publishing project. Danielle Dutton in her blurb said that these are stories that feel like they exist in an alternate dimension. This is an experimental, absurdist, strange, unsettling collection of stories. There are twins who are separated at birth and sent thousands of miles apart, but are like accidentally given the same name. There is a woman named Crisis of Faith who suffers from, you guessed it, a crisis of faith, and gets on an airplane to Mesoamerica to try to come to terms with her spirituality, try to fix what's going on in her soul. There are stories that take the form of lists, which is a structure I always enjoy in a short story, but then there are also longer stories that actually have full chapters to them. There's a real mix. In a lot of these stories, you can feel overtly and just running under the surface too. Sometimes you feel an almost desperate struggle with capitalism and capitalist mechanisms. There are also some very visual elements in here, like drawings, like they feel like pen sketches that give this an almost handmade feel. And even the epigraph sets you up for the rest of the book, because it takes a quote from a Mary Ruefle poem and crosses out the word lemon and replaces it with the word handwritten melon. Jacqueline Zong Lee Ross is a writer and editor based in Vancouver, and The Longest Way to Eat a Melon is her first book. And Sarah Band Books is an award-winning, internationally distributed, nonprofit, independent literary publishing house founded in 1994 in Louisville, Kentucky. And they say Sarah Band Books champions innovative voices in poetry, short fiction, essay, and literature in translation. We're committed to creating lasting editions that honor exceptional writing. And then I checked out their 2023 annual report. They write that as an independent publisher, Sarah Band is not beholden to corporate shareholder value, not subject to the whims of university administrators, and it gives them the freedom to publish books ahead of the curve, to invest in authors who challenge, experiment, and excite. Readers come to Sarah Band for work that sparks their imagination in new ways. The title story, The Longest Way to Eat a Melon, is definitely one of my favorites in the whole collection, and it's the second to last story, and it follows a narrator who is trying to decide the best way to eat a melon. And this narrator asks lots of opinions of the people around them of how to go about tackling this melon. And they start carrying the melon around with them in like a sling, not wanting to mess up this one opportunity to find the perfect way to make that first cut in the melon. And I think it's like their dad says you should do it diagonally, and then the mom says, yes, definitely diagonally. So like there's all sorts of thought going in to how to eat this melon. So that story being the title story made me want to talk about title stories in collections. In a well-built story collection, every story earns its place. It's there for a reason. But at some point, the author, and maybe, in conversation with the publisher or an editor, has to decide what the title of the collection is going to be, and often they choose the title of one of the stories. And so you have to wonder, how does that conversation happen? How does that decision get made? So it just makes me kind of think about like, okay, how do you pick which story title? If you're going to pick a title of a story to be the title of the whole collection, how do they choose? And sometimes I feel like it's just the story with the coolest title, because that would make a cool title for the book too. But often you hope that it's a story that somehow speaks to the collection as a whole, a story that captures the collection's essence in some way. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Do you have examples of story collections where the title story really does feel like it encapsulates the whole collection? In this case, I think it's both, that it's the story with the coolest title. The Longest Way to Eat a Melon is so memorable, but also I think it is the most fitting story to frame the whole collection too. And I'll read the first paragraph of the title story just to give you an idea of what I think the whole collection is reaching for. The Longest Way to Eat a Melon. I hold it quite happily in my arms. This melon that I have spent my whole life tending. It is round and full of potential, bulging with ego and grandiose expectations. We're halfway through the list of nominees. Next up is book number 22. This is Smoke by Gabriella Alemán. It is translated by Dick Cluster and published by City Lights Books. This novel opens with a woman named Gabriella. Take note that the author and one of the main characters of the book share the same first name. I always think that's an interesting, thought-provoking decision. So a woman named Gabriella arrives at the doorstep of an old, kind of creepy, really big house in the capital city of Paraguay. It has been nearly 20 years since she last stepped foot in this house, which once was a place that afforded her refuge. She has arrived to collect an envelope that has been left for her by the recently deceased patriarch of the family that owns this house, a man by the name of Andre. And the envelope contains pages that tell the story of Andre's life, which also just so happened to pretty much tell the story of Paraguay in the 20th century. From there, the book alternates between Andre's story as told in these pages in the envelope, which is a story of survival and adventure and war and of the early seeds of dictatorship in Paraguay's history. And then that's alternating with scenes of Gabriella in the house, who is encountering her own memories and her own perils as well that kind of lurk in this house. It's almost like a very dreamlike overview of the troubled and violent history of Paraguay at this time, and of this one family's not so small role in that history. Gabriella Alemán is the author of 10 books, according to her bio, including the short story collection Family Album, which was also published by City Lights in 2022 and which was longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize back then. She currently lives in Ecuador. She actually lived and studied in Paraguay, which was partially or mostly what inspired her to write this book. And she said in an interview that Paraguay is a country, as she said, you don't see talked much about, and she wanted to herself devote some attention to it. And then I believe in the interview said that she had been working on this novel for 12 years. City Lights is a storied San Francisco-based bookstore and publisher. In 1955, 2 years after opening his paperback bookshop, Lawrence Ferlinghetti launched City Lights Publishers with the Pocket Poets series. The first book published was a book of his own poems, but within a year, City Lights had published its most famous title, which was Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems. City Lights, as they say, has always been a champion of progressive thinking, fully committed to publishing works of both literary merit and social responsibility. With over 400 titles in print, we publish cutting-edge fiction, poetry, memoirs, literary translations, and books on vital social and political issues. So they published, as I mentioned, among their many amazing books, they published Alamon's story collection Family Album. And then also in 2023, the winner of the Republic of Consciousness Prize, United States and Canada, was Largemon, which was also published by City Lights. So I found in this interview that I've already referenced a few times with the author. It was in Spanish, so I ran it through Google Translate, which means it might not be perfectly translated. But in that interview, Alamon said that one of the recurring themes in her work is how the big history involves the small. And that got me thinking, obviously, about this book and the characters in this book, and about how the fact that there are people who never make it into the history books, but still very much play a role in shaping history. But because they're left out of the history books, they're almost invisible until someone decides to imagine them back into life through something like a novel. And you can even expand that from the character level to the topic of Paraguay itself, because the author herself mentioned that it's a country that people rarely talk about, at least on like the global media stage. But then you see how she presents the story of Paraguay in this novel, and you realize that Paraguay has very much played a role in global history, quite often as a pawn for larger global powers. But it has played a big role, an important role that is perhaps ignored in history. And so this book is a way of bringing that history back to life and bringing what has been a forced invisibility into focus. So I want to know, do you have examples of other books that do something similar? Books that take everyday people and overlooked places and takes them from invisibility and imagines them back into life and imagines them back into center stage. I would love to hear your examples, and here is mine. Next up on the nominee list is book number 23, but again, in no particular order. It's First Kicking, Then Not by Hannah Grieco, and it's published by Stanchion. It's rare that I come across a short story collection where the stories are this connected thematically. So much so that a lot of the stories seemed almost like variations on the same theme, or like the same situations, but with details only ever so slightly changed. There was one point where there was a story where I had to flip back to an earlier story to remind myself, like, are these the same characters we're encountering again? Because the situation was so similar, but the names were changed ever so slightly. It was really disorienting, but also very cool. There's a lot of recurring themes in this collection, including running away from bad marriages. There's several mothers who run away from their families, abandon their children. Their divorce is a big theme. Fertility and infertility is a big theme. Weight gain, depression, discovery or rediscovery of queer sexuality, and just generally a lot of characters who are about to reach or have reached a breaking point, sometimes in very extreme ways. There's a story in here about a woman who is running away from a bad marriage. The person who is helping her run away and get to the place where she needs to go is none other than The Rock. And when I first started reading this story, I thought that it was like something surreal. It was like a surreal story about like a physical rock, that this woman was like being accompanied by a physical rock that was helping her run away. But no. It is The Rock, as in Dwayne Johnson, is helping her escape her marriage. Hannah Grieco is a writer, editor, and teacher in Washington, D.C. She writes a monthly literary column for the Washington City paper and edits prose for a variety of independent presses and literary journals. And Stanchion, the publisher, launched initially as a quarterly zine, and as they say, the tumultuous summer of 2020. And then they expanded to publishing books just in 2022, so not that long ago. They publish poetry, short stories, and novella chapbooks. As a mother and a wife myself, reading stories that are a lot about women who are wives and some of whom are also mothers, or at least are there's a discussion of motherhood in the stories. I initially found it really hard to identify with some of the women in these stories who choose to abandon marriages, sometimes even abandon children in like really extreme ways. Some of whom who have very unpleasant husbands, which thankfully is not something I can identify with either because I have a very pleasant husband. But I am not someone who needs to identify with characters to enjoy a novel or a short story. That has never been something that I have looked for or needed in my reading life. I do not feel the need to identify with characters that I'm reading. So I was not at all bothered by the fact that I wasn't really identifying with any of these, like personally connecting and identifying with a lot of these characters. But it got me thinking a little bit about how people often assume that if a reader shares biographical details with a character that they're going to identify with that character. So like as a mother, I would automatically identify with the mothers represented here in these stories. And so what I initially, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, I could come here and talk about like pushing against that automatic assumption that we should be identifying with the characters that we share elements of our identity with. And then I started to challenge myself on that just a little bit, because the more I thought about it, the more I began thinking of like the small ways that I might abandon my responsibilities, even if it is temporarily, the small ways I find to escape. So to give one small example that I was reminding myself of as I was thinking about these stories, I have discovered within myself the incredible ability to read a chapter book out loud to my son while thinking about something else entirely. I can completely disconnect my brain from my voice and read on autopilot and be like miles away, a million miles away, just read. You're reading the words on the page out loud to him and just be somewhere else entirely. I personally think that is a superpower, but also I would say maybe it's not the thing I'm most proud of as a parent. And I think that is a small moment of escape for me, a small moment of like, I don't want to use the word abandonment, but I just felt like that somehow connected with some of the experiences these women are exhibiting in these stories in much more dramatic ways, but it felt connected. And then once I realized that connection, I started to see these stories as much more cathartic. Actually, it was like an expression, a big expression of those smaller like desires of escape. That, of course, sent me down a huge rabbit hole of like questioning what I originally said, which is that I don't feel the need to connect with characters when I'm reading a book. When I realized like, oh, I feel like so much more connected to these stories now that I kind of see, I can make that connection between myself and those stories. So make of that what you will, but I do want to ask you, are there any books where you didn't think you could identify with a character at first, especially if perhaps they were doing something a little questionable, making some questionable choices. But the more you thought about it, the more you saw some small reflection of yourself in those characters. Let me know in the comments. This is my example for you. Can you believe that's just the first half of all the books nominated for this year's prize? It is incredible. The long list is usually announced in mid-January-ish. That will be 10 books from the nominated books. And then the short list is nominated several weeks after that. And then the winner is usually announced in March. So stay tuned for all of those dates, which we'll be sharing soon. I'll be back in a week or two with the next set of nominees. If you like literary fiction that is offbeat, under the radar, you're not going to want to miss a single one of these books. I can't wait to share them with you. My name is Sarah. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.